Welcome to these sessions with the invite keynote by Gale Sinatra. Gale Sinatra is a Stephen Prof Professor of Education and Psychology at Lucia School of Education at the University of Southern California, where she is the director of the research lab Motivated Change. Gale obtained her bachelor, master, and PhD degrees from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She was then a researcher and teaching assistant at the university, then instructor at the University of Pittsburgh, assistant and then associate professor at the University of Utah, then professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, professor at the University of Southern California, where she also acted as associate dean for research. Gale areas of research are conceptual change learning, motivation and emotion, public understanding of science, and science learning. And her keynote today will be at the intersection of all these research areas. She obtained very prestigious awards, many prestigious awards, as you can see. I have listed here only the awards of the last 10 years. An international award for excellence from the International Journal of Climate Change for the impact of an article co-authored with students Abby Beck and Doug Lombardi, who is here in the audience. Then a mentoring award. She was elected president of the American Psychological Association, Division 15, Educational Psychology, ranked in 2018, ranked among the top most productive women in educational psychology. She also won the Sylvia Scribner Award from Division C, Learning Instruction of the American Educational Research Association, another excellent in research award from USC, and very recently she was elected member of the National Academy of Education. So, on a more personal note, Gale is not excellent scientist, as I try to outline in a few words, but is also a very close and nice friend of mine. She has Italian origins. Her grandfather was from Agrigento in Sicily, and when I went to Agrigento for a vacation, we asked a certificate, birth certificate of her grandfather, because Gale is trying to obtain an Italian citizenship. She is eligible for Italian citizenship, but she must learn Italian. She is progressing. I can say that it is excellent in comprehension of restaurant menus, much more than me. And many times she said that she is more Italian than me. So, I visited Gale when she was at the University of Las Vegas. She guested me in her beautiful house for a week. She visited me in Padova, and we spent some enjoyable time shopping. Also in Milan, you remember? We bought shoes and fashion glasses in Milan. So, okay. But now we are ready to learn from your research achievements, and so now the floor is yours, okay?
Grazie, mia amica.
Thank you. This is a demonstration of the Italian content. The new edition.
The new edition.
Update edition.
Can you hear me okay? Yes. So the reason I say I'm more Italian than Lucia is because she is a vegetarian and she doesn't like to cook. And she doesn't drink wine, so I'm totally more Italian than...
I don't drink coffee.
And she doesn't drink coffee, like she's disqualified. But because I am my family's from Sicily, from Agrigento, which was first settled by the Greeks, today I am Greek. So the title of my talk is Why Deny the Psychology of Public Understanding, or maybe Misunderstanding of Science. And I want to thank the program committee. I came here in 2016 for the SIG 8 motivation SIG meeting and loved it. I'm so grateful to be back and in Thessaloniki. I want to thank the program committee, the president, all the members, and everybody in the blue shirts that I've been bugging to find rooms. Eferisto to everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so honored to be here. All right, so public understanding of science. Well, why does that matter? This is the beach border between two counties in Florida in the United States. And this picture was taken in April of 2020. So you will recall that was the height of the initial stages of the pandemic. And you can see literally a line in the sand where the different scientific interpretations of the policy led to completely different situations, even down a beach in Florida. So we all need to make informed decisions about scientific issues in our day-to-day lives, and they affect what we do, they affect policy, they affect everything. So that's why my dear colleague, Barbara Hofer, who is teaching in Copenhagen this semester. So anyone who is in Copenhagen, you can go look her up. She's teaching a freshman seminar right now for Middlebury College, where she's emeritus status faculty, but she's teaching in Copenhagen, a first year experience, and so you can look her up if you are there. So this is why Barbara and I wrote this book together. So first we have to get some terminology. In the book we called it Science Denial because this title was too long, but the book is really about science denial, doubt, and resistance. So let's talk about each one. Denial, doubt, resistance. So the first thing to note is we are all susceptible to this. So when I talk to general public audiences, Barbara and I have done about 30 podcasts and lectures on the book, and we always get the question about, well, who are those people, those science deniers, those people who doubt science? It is not a personality characteristic. It is something everyone is susceptible to. It is not an us or them issue, and I'll give some examples as we go along. First, what is denial? Denial is a belief-based stance, and you are using your beliefs to reject scientific evidence. So we see this by our former president, who loved to say global warming is a hoax. He's being arrested today, so there is that. It's a good day. It's a good day. People also say the earth is flat. You all educated scientific people think that no one believes this. There are people who actually do believe this. We have a flat earth society. There's a very famous basketball player in the United States and a co-host to a very popular morning television show who both said they do not believe the earth is round. This is a real thing. Obviously not very common, but it is a real thing. And there's quite a few people who believe that vaccines cause autism. This goes back to the famous Andrew Wakefield fabricated study in the Lancet that was withdrawn, and he was kicked out, but still carried on, and people still, to this day, believe the association, even though massive amount of research suggests that is not the case. But it's not as common denial as is, you know, this more cafeteria denial, picking and choosing. That is more common. We even do that ourselves. So even well-educated people who accept science do have some you pick and choose a little bit. I saw a study that said postmenopausal women should eat chocolate for breakfast and you would lose weight, and I thought, that's a good study. But then Barbara and I looked at it, and you know, it didn't have a control group. It only had 16 participants. And I was like, but I wanted to believe. Doubt and resistance are the most common, and this is especially the case when the findings don't fit with your personal beliefs. That's when it really comes into conflict, particularly with social identity. So we'll talk a lot about social identity, but social identity is where people really ground their beliefs about so many things, and also about science. And you know, also when things take a deeper analysis, that not everybody is willing to put in the need for cognition there, might not be there. Now, what's very important to remember is not to blame individuals, well, not all individuals, not to blame them for their doubt or their resistance, because doubt is manufactured. And this is really important to remember. Doubt is manufactured by vested interests, tobacco industry, petroleum industry. This picture is a bunch of tobacco executives who famously, more than 20 years ago, testified in front of US Congress, raising their hands and swearing that tobacco did not have any ill health effects, which they knew well was not true. And there's a great book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway called Merchants of Doubt that goes through this explanation. And it's so important because this is the playbook that climate deniers use today. Evolution deniers use it. Everyone uses the playbook from this tobacco industry's original manufacturing of doubt, and they brilliantly lay out how that was done and how it still impacts us today. So people are sort of, you know, ready to believe these things, but then it's pushed on them and they fall prey. Now, one question we get a lot is, but wait a minute, shouldn't you just be skeptical of, you know, a 20-person, you know, study of, you know, chocolate for breakfast? Yes, you should. So skepticism is a healthy part of the scientific process, but skepticism can also run awry if you are skeptical of everything, and that's what we're seeing now. That leads to an erosion of trust, epistemic doubt, we would call that, in a real crisis of not believing anything, which of course is dangerous. But healthy skepticism is a natural and productive part of the scientific process. So why trust science at all? Like, you know, should we trust science at all? Well, Oreskes, in another great book called Why Trust Science, she talks about science relies on empirical evidence, it's carefully collected, it's analyzed, and builds on prior findings, accumulates evidence over time. And the real key is that it's a collective enterprise, and through peer review and expert vetting of ideas, it should be self-correcting. That's the theory, right? We all know as scientists who participate in the process that it has lots of flaws, that it's very imperfect, that it can be racist, it can be misogynist, it can be wrong. However, she argues in her book, Why Trust Science, that those things correct themselves over time. Barbara and I take a little different point of view. We actually go along more with Lee McIntyre, who's a philosopher. And Lee McIntyre says that, you know, it's really the scientific attitude and the valuing of a scientific attitude. What is a scientific attitude? It's openness to seek new evidence and a willingness to change one's mind in light of new evidence. And Barbara and I say that that's what we should value in ourselves and strive for in our students. So Barbara and I go way back on this. Where did we come around to these ideas? We wrote this article almost 10 years ago now about public understanding of science and what could you do to enhance it. And we talked about things like overcoming misconceptions, We talked about how to think about uncertainty in science, because that's thought about differently than how lay people think about the construct of uncertainty. We talked about epistemic trust, how do you figure out who to trust. We talked about evaluating competing knowledge claims and how you can leverage motivations and emotions and conflicting beliefs and shift those, and how you can support the development of positive attitudes. So that was about 10 years ago, and what you'll see is these themes end up in the book. But today, given our time, I'm just going to talk about a few of the themes from the book with just an example or two of each, and then obviously we can talk more during the question period. So I'm going to talk about these: the conceptual challenges, the digital environment of mis and disinformation, how to shift beliefs on hot topics, epistemic cognition and its role, identity, motivation, and emotion. So starting with conceptual challenges, one of the things we talk about in the book are thinking and reasoning biases. And the reason we talk about this is, again, we all have them. This is not a us or them sort of thing. We talk about over-reliance on system one, making those snap judgments, whereas system two is more the reflective, analytical, deliberative system, and we often don't bring that into play. When you see something online, you click on it and then share it without really reading the article. That's your system one thinking, clicking in. And then there's others like confirmation bias, where you seek and interpret information that aligns better with your existing beliefs. Availability heuristic, that's when you believe information because it's available to you. And we see this a lot in the US with false balance reporting about science. You have Bill Nye, the science guy, and an evolution denier on at the same time, and that gives an overrepresentation of misinformation. So this picture here is the senator from the great state of Oklahoma. There was a massive snowstorm, unpredicted, in Washington, D.C. late in the season. This was a long time ago, very unpredicted. He went out outside, got a snowball, brought it into the Senate floor and said there's no such thing as climate change. See, it snows in Washington, D.C. So it was called Snowmageddon because it was, created such a challenge. And he became known as Senator Snowball. My graduate student who's here, Laurel Kirkish, she's here in the second row, has been working with me, Norbert Schwartz, and Wendy Brun on a study to look at those quick reactions we have to terminology. How should we talk about climate change? Words matter. The public perception of climate change is something that we really care about. So we're exploring different climate terms and looking at the initial quick triggering reactions people have to those messages. We have a nationally representative sample, which is hard to get in the US, but important given there's so much diversity of opinion, and you can't just do this in Southern California for obvious reasons. And we look at climate terms like climate change, climate emergency, climate crisis, climate justice, and compared to global warming, the older term. So we asked a bunch of questions like, are people familiar with these terms? How concerned do these terms elicit much concern? Or how important is it for people to act? And do they create urgency? And we looked at political affiliations. Laurel presented this study earlier in the conference. I'm just going to highlight a couple of findings. It's a cool national, I'm very excited that it's a nationally represented sample. We're still collecting data right now. We hope to have 6,000 participants. This is just really preliminary findings. So do the terms differ in familiarity? They do, but what's interesting is climate change and global warming are very, very familiar terms to people. And we were surprised to see that climate crisis, climate emergency, and climate justice were a little less familiar. Climate justice was the least familiar. So climate justice is the term that a lot of people in the US and the progressive climate movement are saying we should use because, of course, we want to highlight the inequities that climate change is creating. But as you see here, this term has not yet caught on. And when we examine the data separately by political affiliation, not only are conservatives in the US, Republicans, not really sure what it means, they're not sure that they're in favor of it either. So it may not resonate well. What about concern? Well, all the terms except climate justice elicited a pretty high level of concern, and this is a finding that's been changing over time. Ever since I met Doug Lombardi, who's hopefully here in the audience somewhere, wave your hand, there you are. Ever since I met Doug Lombardi, I've been very interested in research on climate change and working with him as often as I get a chance to. And over the time that we've been working together, I've noticed a real shift, that this has moved up in the United States, the level of concern. But again, what we're seeing is climate justice isn't quite cutting it. It's eliciting much less concern. This is aggregated data, not separated out by political affiliation. So for the Republicans, it's much, much lower. And the most important thing now, of course, is not just to be concerned, but to actually take actions. So we measured a bunch of actions and asked whether people were willing to take them. So how willing are people to act? Even climate crisis and climate emergencies doing pretty well in terms of eliciting willingness to act, even climate justice. This particular example is about willing to eat less red meat, and climate justice is a little lower, and again lower with Republicans. So anyway, to sum up a really big study that we're in the middle of analyzing, the movement to move to climate justice terminology is maybe premature based on these data in regards to wanting to influence those people who need to be influenced. Progressives love that term, but they're already on the bus, so we're suggesting that maybe it's a little premature, or we need to do more education about justice. Climate change is still as good, and so is global warming. This is a term that we don't use much in the United States anymore, and yet it's very familiar with people. So you can use any of those terms. But we would hold off, I think, on replacing climate change with climate justice just yet. All right, so that study is supposed to illustrate, our quick reactions. That was just really quick reactions to terminology and how those System 1 things kick in. I'm going to move on now to the digital environment of mis- and disinformation. Science denial isn't new. That's been going on, since Galileo, I guess, probably sooner. But today, what's different is the amplification through social media of information, misinformation, and disinformation. This is the movie Don't Look Up. Barbara and I were delighted. We were invited to the premiere of this movie, which was very cool, we have to say. But we were invited because the theme of the movie is science denial. And if you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's hilarious and sad. So, how do we make sense of science claims in a digital world? How do we decide what knowledge is valid? And what we see is people actually are more likely to believe science articles posted by their friends than on Facebook than expert sources. So we all live in social media bubbles, but this believing your friends over scientists has created an erosion of trust in expertise, this sort of epistemic trust crisis, Barbara and I would say. So what do we do about that? Well, again, my colleague Doug Lombardi and my colleague Imogen Herrick have been putting together the different strategies that have been used by so many people who've done research in this room. We've drawn on all your work for this article of how to evaluate scientific claims online. The first thing is, this is an article for teachers, so if you want to use this for your teacher preparation programs, let us know, we'll send you a copy. So the first thing is to step back and read, like not just share, not just click and share. Don't fall prey to that System 1. Next, what you want to do is become your own fact checker based on the work of Sarah McGrew and Sam Weinberg. We're advocating something called lateral reading. So instead of reading down when you Google something, you should open another window, read laterally, read across, and you should check out the source and use all the source and strategies of our experts here in the room that have taught us how to source. Use all of those. Make a judgment, and we rely on Doug Lombardi's plausibility work to say how we should judge whether a claim is plausible, and then we want to evaluate evidence, and we want to evaluate the connection between the evidence and the claim, reappraise that, plausibility judgment, and then you make your decisions. So this sounds like, oh, this would take hours. to do, but it's not. We've actually trained students to do this, and after you get used to it, it actually just takes, a minute or two per article you find online to do some of these steps. So, moving on to shifting beliefs on hot topics. So, you probably know that I've been doing research on conceptual change, and it's very difficult to change public opinion, particularly on controversial topics. Barbara and I have written about this with Dorte Keinhus. And what we talked about in this particular article is what we call the hat trick of change. People who are hockey fans in here know that that means 3 goals. So we have 3 goals, and those are to change people's representations of conceptual knowledge and overcome misconceptions. So that's the first one, conceptual change. But we also feel it's really important to shift attitudes and emotions. We put those together because in all of our research, the attitudes and the emotions shift together. They're valenced, and in our research, they've always been valenced in the same direction. So you want to shift towards more positive, or at least less negative. Everyone's told me for 20 years, if people just get really pissed off, they'll change the way they think, and I have never seen that in my data. And then you want to promote epistemic conceptual change, which means you have to change people's thinking about the nature of science itself. Remember that study with, just 20 or whatever participants, no control group. I have to understand the nature of science to understand why that study should not be taken too seriously, so we need to change our concepts about science itself. So, any of you in the room who know my work know that we've been working off this model forever called the Cognitive Reconstruction of Knowledge model. And in this model, we talk about conceptual change, but we also really emphasize, basically warm change about hot topics. In other words, warm change, because we look at affective values, we looked at affective and motivational constructs like values, goals, beliefs, self-efficacy, interest, emotions, epistemic motives, many more. Only could fit those on the slide. And we've looked at a lot of hot topics that are controversial in the United States. Obviously, climate change we've looked at a lot. GMOs that we eat for food, and scientific uncertainty are some of the topics that we have explored. My colleague Vivian Saranian and I have sort of looked at the specific interaction between conceptual knowledge and attitudinal knowledge. I said they're related and linked. How are they related and linked? Well, sometimes you can have accurate knowledge or you can have inaccurate knowledge. But you can also have either pro or con attitudes. Remember, attitudes are valence. They're either pro or con. And we've sort of looked at knowledge in these 4 categories. This last one, where you have inaccurate knowledge and a negative attitude, my students like to call low-hanging fruit, because people in this category are most open to change, because we have found in our research that when you upend their misconceptions, it's sometimes the misconceptions that are keeping them from changing. A recent example would be my own niece was reluctant to get the COVID vaccine because her friend on Facebook told her it caused infertility. She's a young woman, she wants to get married and have children. So she said, I'm not going to get vaccinated because I want to have kids. And I said, well, I think you need to talk to your doctor about that, because I have not heard that that's true. Talk to your doctor and see what your doctor says. So, of course, her doctor told her that that wasn't true. So she went and she got vaccinated, and then she convinced her Facebook friend to get vaccinated as well. Small victory. All right, so how can you, what are the different ways you can change these misunderstandings about science? We've looked a lot recently at the debunking literature. So you might be familiar with the debunking handbook, and if you aren't, you can take a picture of that QR code and you can get the debunking handbook. Doug Lombardi, Jeff Green, I'm pretty sure. No, not Jeff. Pani, I knew it was somebody right there. Pani had a huge influence. Doug, many other people in the room I'm probably forgetting, I'm sorry. And I participated in putting together this debunking handbook with Lewandowski, who is the leader of the project. And what they say is, you know, misinformation is sticky, so you want to try to prevent it from getting into people's minds in the first place. Hard. But if it does, it can be debunked. One of the things that people tell me all the time is, oh, you can't refute misinformation. They just double down. They just double down. Well, actually, if you do it right, you can avoid backfire effects. You have to explain why the misinformation is false. In the debunking handbook, they recommend this fact sandwich. So you present facts, you warn about a potential misconception or myth, you explain why that is not true, and then you end with supporting facts. In this article, some of that team lays out the research behind, so the debunking handbook is really the strategies, but in this article by Ecker et al. In Nature, some of those same authors lay out the actual research behind different techniques of debunking. One, for example, is pre-bunking. So stop the misinformation before it even starts by exposing people to like a weakened version of the misinformation. This is supposed to create cognitive antibodies, and using an inoculation metaphor. Sander van der Linden just came out with a whole book on this called Foolproof, I believe. So it includes a warning plus a refutation, and it also often includes, pre-bunking strategies include misinformation techniques and teach people what these misinformation techniques are, such as cherry-picking data. So you might be aware that I've used one particular debunking technique a lot, and it's refutation texts. I've done this with my colleague, Lucia, and with many people in the room, and we advocate using the three-part structure from the PrEP model developed by my colleague, Pani Kengyo. And in that structure, you state the misconception, you refute the misconception, you explain the scientifically valid position, and that's really important. If you don't do the explanation, you're just telling people they're wrong, and they can get pissed off and they can backfire. But we have found that if you actually give the explanation, backfire effects are very low or non-existent. We also have found in a variety of studies that refutation text can not only shift misconceptions, it can actually shift attitudes about these topics. We're currently finishing up a NSF-funded meta-analysis of refutation text with my colleagues listed here, and we have that under review. And we're very excited about that because it does show that this is a useful strategy. We've done it with the greenhouse effect, we've done it with climate change in several studies. We've also done it with GMOs. We've done it with scientific uncertainty. So these are just a couple of examples of the topics we have used effectively. And of course, many other people, including Lucia, Stella, other people in the room, obviously has done a ton of these studies. Many of you are included in our meta-analysis. So this meta-analysis is under review. We reviewed quite a lot of studies, and we have a decent effect size showing that we have a small to medium effect of refutations compared to expository texts. And you know what we're finding is there's nothing that really mediates that effect. It's kind of a strong and consistent effect over time. So we're hopeful we can get that published and share that with you. All right, moving on. Next up, epistemic cognition. So, you know, Barbara Hofer has been studying this for many, many years. We've worked on it a bit together, but epistemic cognition obviously is a very influential part of a scientific understanding. It's how individuals think and reason about knowledge and knowing, and ask questions about what is knowledge, where our sources of knowledge come from, and what influences scientific understanding. Obviously, this comes into play in science when people decide what counts as evidence, resolve competing knowledge claims, have to evaluate information critically, have to integrate multiple sources of information, and incorporate new knowledge. We draw tremendously on Doug's work here on the plausibility judgments that create epistemic conceptual change, and that informs our research in this area. If you haven't seen this article, you should, it's awesome. And Doug has used this instructional scaffold, originally developed by Clark Chin and his colleagues, extensively. Doug's used it with many colleagues that he's working with, and he's used it with lots of different topics like climate change, fracking, astronomy topics, lots of different topics. And what this instructional scaffold asks students to do is to weigh evidence against two models, a scientific model and a skeptic model. So in climate change, it would be human-induced climate change versus like increased solar radiation, for example. And students are asked in various iterations of this, and Doug's tested this every which way but loose, and he has found this to be a very effective strategy for students to evaluate scientific evidence and claims against these two models. And they decide whether these evidence supports or strongly supports or contradicts or has nothing to do with the model. And he's engaged in a very large-scale project that I have a tiny, tiny bit of with him and his many colleagues across multiple states in a further iteration of this, integrated with sourcing scientific information, as we've just talked about a few minutes ago. So stay tuned for all those findings. Back to epistemic trust. What sources of knowledge do we trust? And this decline in trust really is a problem. Social identity is related to this. So in the United States, Dr. Fauci was our main medical expert, and Fauci became either a hero or a villain. He had to have security, he had death threats. It got completely out of hand in the United States. And that's because people were sort of encouraged to mistrust information based on their social identity, and who you trust comes from that identity group. Now, I want to be very clear, there's lots of good reasons to mistrust science, particularly among communities of color or historically marginalized groups who've been mistreated by science. So there's good reasons to be skeptical or mistrusting of science, and there are bad reasons as well. All right, moving on. Identity, motivation, and emotion. So as we've been saying, social identity is your group membership, and that influences your views of science. And individuals conform to the attitudes and views of their group. My colleagues Vivian Saranian and Ann Kim wrote about this. What we know is that in-group messages are more persuasive. So the reason this social identity work is important is because if you want to construct messages, you really have to understand how those messages have to come from inside the house. So in-group messages are more persuasive. So for example, during COVID, when a lot of communities wouldn't get vaccinated, pastors in Southern Baptist churches in the South, which in the United States was very reluctant to get vaccinated, were holding vaccination clinics after services on Sunday. And they would literally get up on the pulpit and encourage people to get vaccinated, and they'd march out after ceremony and get vaccinated. So, sense of self is really tied up with your social identity. And mask wearing in the United States, I'm not sure what happened in Europe, but it went cuckoo in the United States. And mask wearing became something that was completely divided along political lines, as if somehow the virus knew whether you were a Democrat or a Republican. We've used strategies, like I said, the call has to be coming from inside the house. We've used strategies to leverage social identity and to be persuasive in communications. In this case, this study by Vivian Saranian and my colleague Morgan Polikoff, we used social identity framing to communicate about water usage. So we know in-group messages are more persuasive, so what's the trick? Change the in-group. So, for example, at the University of Southern California, one of the things we do is we try to have zero-waste football games, and let me correct myself, zero-waste American football games. And what we say is, we Trojans is our mascot, we Trojans, we recycle. So the we, right? We don't say you should recycle, we say we. So that's social identity framing. We compared communication strategies based on either what's called the knowledge deficit view, which is in the United States, utility companies send you messages often about how much electricity or water you are using in your house, relatively so to your neighbors. And guess what happens? That backfires. Because you find out, hey, I'm taking 4-minute showers, the guy next door is using all this water. So you find out your neighbor is using more than you, and it actually ends up that you use more. So we wanted to say, well, maybe if we use social identity framing and say we Southern Californians, we conserve water, that people would pay more attention to that. We did this study in August in Southern California. It was hot as heck, and we actually measured water consumption. I could tell you how to do that, but I'm pretty sure it was illegal, so I don't want to give you the details. Water meters are sort of kind of on the street. Anyway, what we found, wasn't my undergrads that were out there, somebody else's. Anyway, what we found was that the social identity framing worked, whereas the knowledge deficit backfired. And we actually had people reduce water consumption in the social identity framing group using the we language. So, point of that is, don't run from social identity, leverage it. Can't go away from this topic of motivation without mentioning motivated reasoning. Everyone knows what motivated reasoning is, but motivated reasoning biases our understanding of evidence, because sometimes we'll decide what evidence we want to accept based on our preferred conclusions. So we know, research has shown, that individuals are much more critical of the methods of a research study when they don't like the outcomes. Maybe you've seen that in the review process. Just saying. But our identity, as we just talked about, not only shapes our acceptance of particular topics, it shapes our motivation and reasoning about those scientific topics as well. How does that happen? Well, we talked about that in that article I mentioned. For example, social identity will tell you, well, I'm a conservative. Conservatives don't like climate change, so I don't like climate change. It may be vested interest. Interesting enough that countries with higher GDPs have lower climate acceptance. That's not surprising, really. They have a vested interest. We already mentioned cognitive biases. Availability heuristic tells us that, hey, it snowed yesterday, climate change is over. And epistemic motives. People are very uncomfortable with ambiguity. We see a lot of people saying, oh, the climate models aren't right. Models aren't right. If we had all the data, we wouldn't call it a model. We just call it facts. So models are never 100% right, but people don't understand what scientific uncertainty means, and they'll say, well, those models are only, 89% certain. How many in here would just give your left arm for an 89% prediction? Thank you, wouldn't you? They're pretty darn good. All right, so what do we do in actual practice out in the world to impact motivation, emotion, and interest in young science learners so that we can, promote a healthier science view in our country? It's a lot of work. This was a project we did a number of years ago called Speedometry. What we did here is we tried to leverage students' innate interest in play by using a popular toy car, Hot Wheels, Cars and Tracks. So Mattel's having a moment right now, if you've seen or heard of the Barbie movie. So Mattel does Barbies and it does Hot Wheels, and I'll never forget the first time I went. It was great seeing the movie because I remember going to their corporate headquarters. And when you go in, you have all the Barbies on one side and all the Hot Wheels on the others, which I said, I want you guys to make me a pink Tesla, and they were like, no. We don't make pink cars. It's like, why? Maybe they will now with the Barbie movie. So anyway, we created this curriculum, speedometry, and it was leveraging the enjoyment students have with play, and we were teaching fourth graders about force and motion by asking them to ask research questions of the cars, like which cars are faster, and they did experiments, and it was great. But I want to highlight more recent work by my colleague Imogen Herrick. What she's doing, I think, is just amazing. She's created something she calls Community Science Data Talks. She's not here with us today because her first day of class was yesterday, teaching in her new faculty position at Kansas University. So what are Community Science Data Talks? What she has students do is teachers and students download local climate data. And this is real-time data about their neighborhood. And this data conveys things like heat islands, which are a big factor in Los Angeles, and tree canopy cover, for example. So all sorts of different statistics, and they download it by neighborhood. And she looks at highly impacted neighborhoods, like East LA, and she looks at wealthier neighborhoods like Santa Monica. And she has students ask questions like, what do you see? And who's impacted by this data? How are they affected? And most importantly, how does this make you feel? So we have a famous feminist in the United States who used to like to say, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. So what Imogen is doing is she's making sure teachers are prepared with affective pedagogical goals to deal with the fact that students might say, hey, why has my neighborhood got fewer parks and green spaces and fewer trees than this neighborhood that's only 10 miles away? What's up with that? So at first they might get concerned, and you have to be prepared as a teacher to understand and know how you're going to deal with these emotions that come up. And what she finds is deeper emotions is not a problem. It actually creates deeper engagement. That'll surprise none of the emotions researchers in the room. And she sees this wonderful relationship between their sense of place, their pride in their community, and their emotions. And she sets up these affective pedagogical goals to be generative. So as they have these emotions, they change as they download more data, learn more, and it's just this iterative process. And what she finds at the end is she finds that the highly impacted communities process those negative emotions towards action. So the kids will say things like, oh, let's go plant more trees. We need to plant more trees in our community. What she finds in the wealthy neighborhoods is an increase in empathy. They say things like, I didn't know those neighborhoods didn't have as many trees as we do. Anyway, it's amazing work, and I hope you get a chance to look at it. All right, most recently what we've been doing in place-based science learning is we've been working at La Brea Tar Pits in Los Angeles. And La Brea is the coolest place. If you ever come to LA, let me know. I'll get you a backstage tour of La Brea. La Brea is a working archaeological site in the middle of downtown Los Angeles, which is crazy. There's people currently excavating every day fossils right next door to the LA County Art Museum. It's just weird. What we did is we developed 2 virtual reality exhibits at La Brea Tar Pits because it's really hard to sort of figure out what's going on there, right? You can't see the Ice Age animals that had been wandering around Hollywood. You can't see that. So we have participants basically dig in a bubbling virtual pit of asphalt, pull out fossils, and send them to the lab, this is all virtual, to be identified. And it helps them to understand the Ice Age environment of Los Angeles. In the second experience, called the field experience, they're out on a field, literally. We always say we're collecting data in the field. We were literally collecting data in a field. Participants see an entrapment scene. So how is it that so many dire wolves get entrapped? Well, what happens is, a sloth or a mammoth gets entrapped and then is struggling, and then the dire wolves come thinking they're going to free meal, and they get entrapped, and etc. So in this experience, and if you look carefully in the photo, you might recognize someone in that photo. In this experience, life-size mammals, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, they walk right past you. You haven't figured it out yet? It's Cecilia Lindholm? Cecilia, you here? It's Cecilia. She came and demoed our experience last summer. So this helps people understand how animals get stuck in the tar. What we did is a full-scale RCT on both the Pit 91, where you dig, and the field experience, where you see the life-size animals walk past you. And we have different conditions. We have low interactivity and high interactivity conditions. And we have different technical conditions too, like whether you wear a headset or whether you do the handheld just with your phone. The headset's a little bit more immersive, but this is a museum. How many people want to put a headset on, particularly post-COVID, even when you provide wipes? And so the handheld is probably going to end up being what they'll install because it'll be more practical. And the comparisons, like how do we know? How do we know what compared it to? We had a typical poster control. This is the poster that we made that contains the information that is in the VR. Why do we use a poster? Because this is typical signage. You have it at a museum. This is typically what is there. So we wanted to use the typical control, and we had people read the poster, and they read it for about 20 seconds. The longest was about 90. But what happens when you give them the AR experience, they watch it for 12 minutes. And often ask us, do you have any more? So there's more exposure. That is really the thing that we noticed. We're currently analyzing the interest in emotions data, but we think people will be more interested and will be more engaged with the AR. This is some of our results. We're not seeing tremendous differences among the conditions. We had an artist do the poster. It's just too beautiful. We set ourselves up for that. So we don't see a lot of everybody learned about Ice Age Los Angeles, but we don't see a lot of big differences in learning outcomes based on the AR versus control. But what we do see is a real perspective change comes out when they visually see what's happening. So here's a comment from one of our participants who just reviewed the poster. I was surprised by how many things the tar pits preserved, including plants like plants. And I was surprised there was constant running water and things like that, like fish. Most people think Ice Age means everything was ice, but in Los Angeles it was not. But in the AR condition, they say things like, well, I first thought it was icy and actually like glaciers and all that stuff, but obviously after seeing the experience, it changed my perspective of everything. It was wet and there were trees, and I just thought, but ice and all that. So you get more of this kind of reaction with the AR. Funny is that, and Cecilia can tell you more about it, when they put the headset on and they start wandering around, we actually have to follow our participants around so they don't actually get stuck in the tar pits themselves. You should see my IRB, my ethics, you guys call it, to get the study approved. You had to go through quite a bit. Anyway, moving on. They made a film about this, it's a 5-minute film, and they showed it at NSTA, National Science Teachers Association in the United States. And I have a little clip from it here, but I don't know if the auditory will come through. So we'll see. We were afraid of that. All right, so we will not be able to show you that as I had hoped, but let's just try one more thing. Talk about why we did the project, and if anybody's interested, I can send you the link to the actual 5-minute film. All right, so moving on, important part of our book was to the second part of the title, right? So the first part was why does it happen? But the second part of the title was what can you do about it? Because obviously we have to take action. So in every chapter of our book and in a whole complete chapter at the end, we really talk about what it is you can do to affect these things. And we have action steps for individuals, educators, policymakers, and science communicators. So what can individuals do? Well, as we noted, we want individuals to culture a scientific attitude in ourselves, right? And nurture an appreciation for science in others. Improve our search skills. We are working on that with our research colleagues. And be able to evaluate scientific claims and sources online. Be aware of our own cognitive biases and our own motivations in our own reasoning, because as we said at the beginning, we can fall prey to these biases ourselves. Listen to others with curiosity, compassion, and openness. Barbara had a climate denier come to one of her talks she gave independently of me, and he came up afterwards and she invited him to coffee. And they had a very nice conversation, and at one point she turned to him and she said, he was an older gentleman, she said, "Do you have grandchildren?" He said, "Yeah." She goes, "I have grandchildren, and I'm worried about what the future's going to be like." And the conversation changed, and they had a really good conversation. He didn't exactly convert to a climate acceptor in one conversation, but he admitted he's just concerned about costs, which is a legitimate concern, right? Everybody's concerned, how are we going to fix this problem? It's going to cost a lot. So he had some legitimate concerns and maybe was a little bit less of a denier than she had thought he might be. We need to vote and support people who will fund science and who will make policy-based decisions about science based on evidence. That's a big deal for us in the United States. What can educators do? Well, first, we need to enhance their own scientific understanding. There's a lot of teachers in the United States that really don't have a lot of science background at all, particularly in elementary classrooms. And so they're reluctant to teach science because they don't feel prepared. When we taught that speedometry curriculum to 2,000 kids in East LA, we trained the teachers how to implement it, and I had several teachers come up to me and say, "I'm so happy, this is the first time I've ever taught science." It's like, ouch. Obviously teach about the nature of science itself. That's really important. It's not just facts, because obviously nobody really believes fake news and all that, so no one really just wants facts anymore. And if you teach about the nature of science, you can understand, like, why is it that policies around COVID changed at the beginning of the pandemic? Well, it was a novel coronavirus, and so the research was new, and obviously it would be changing, and people who understood science understood why decisions were changing. Foster scientific thinking and scientific attitudes in all students. For example, not just science students. I'm on the Presidential Working Group for Sustainability at my university, and we are infusing sustainability education throughout the curriculum. We're not going to build a school of sustainability like Stanford did, the billion-dollar gift. We're going to instead infuse it, because we don't want it to be like, oh, it's their responsibility over there. It's everyone's responsibility. So if you're a business major, climate change is going to affect you in future business. If you're an architect major, architecture is going to be influenced by climate change. It doesn't matter what your area of expertise is, your job is a climate job. Obviously, real-world applications of science. The place-based work we're doing is trying to capitalize on people understanding their own environment and where they live. And One of the scientists that we work with at La Brea Tar Pits, Emily Lindsay, just published a study last week in Science showing why did some of the large mammals go extinct? Why aren't there mammoths running around causing havoc in Hollywood? Because of fires. Fires changed the environment. It's a fascinating study. So what are we doing right now? We're changing the environment. We have fires in California. We have fires here right now in Greece. So fires change the environment, and she has evidence that that was partially responsible for the extinction of large mammals in Los Angeles. So these are real-world applications of the science we are learning. Letting students choose how they want to explore these areas of inquiry themselves, that's something we've talked about in science education for decades, and we need to do it. Obviously being aware of prior beliefs, attitudes, and identities, like Imogen Herrick's work about being prepared with affective pedagogical goals to be ready when students experience strong emotions. There's a lot of climate anxiety among youth. Susan Clayton's work shows that if youth become active, they don't have to become activists, but that's helpful, but if they can become active or activists, they are much more likely to manage their climate anxiety. And obviously that relates to students' emotions. We are trying, like others in the room, to foster digital literacy, particularly digital literacy in science, since that's how most people are learning these days. What can science communicators do? Write about science for the general public. Barbara Hofer and I have published 3 articles in something called The Conversation, which is international. You can Google it, and it's articles written by academics for non-academics. We've had over 400,000 reads. That's more than most of my articles have been cited. So we encourage you to write for outlets like that get your work, because all of you in here are doing this work that I talked about. I don't have all the room on the slides for the citations, but many of you in here are included in our work as we utilize your work. So write about your work for the general public. Write about how scientists know as much as what they know. In the United States, we've lost a lot of science journalism because we've lost a lot of local news media. Print news in particular. You know, the local newspapers have just really gone by the wayside there, and that's why people are watching more, you know, Fox News, which is, you know, daily providing misinformation about politics, science, and just about everything else. Know your audience and the likely misconceptions, motivation, attitudes, and emotions and identities they have. That's a no-brainer for this audience, but I've presented to scientists a lot about my work, and I've had a scientist who studies ice cores in Antarctica come up to me and said, I don't know any misconceptions people have about ice cores. I'm like, oh, honey, they do. Let's talk. So how can you communicate with your students about misconceptions if you aren't aware of them? I've had evolutionary biologists tell me, there's no evolution deniers in my classroom. I'm like, there's just none you know about. Provide the evidence for scientific claims and avoid the both sidesism. I think BBC famously years ago said they're going to stop doing the 50-50, you know, here's a climate scientist and here's a climate denier. But in the United States, we still do a lot of this, both sides. And, you know, journalists are trained like this, and it's just such a hard thing for them to get away from. But it's not, you know, 50-50 when it's 98% of climate scientists versus 2% of skeptics. That's not 50-50. And both sides is really great for opinions, but it's not really great when this doesn't reflect the science. What can policymakers do? Hire and listen to science advisors. Take their advice instead of recommending you drink bleach. That happened in the United States. Hire and listen to scientists and use empirical evidence as the basis for policy decisions. That sounds like so obvious, but that's not what happens in the US a lot. Support educational standards that emphasize how to think over what to think. In other words, emphasizing more of the process of science, since science is changing all the time. Obviously, we have to have content standards, and those are great, but we also need more on how students should think and reason about science. We need to push back more on ignoring factual basis of claims. We see so many claims in interviews, on television, or in print, where people just make these completely outlandish claims, and then the reporter says, so-and-so said this. It's like, but that's completely false. Could you follow up? And no, they don't do that. So it's important to push back and demand more rigorous teacher preparation standards to handle these things. And then, you know, social media. We need to press social media to be more responsible, transparent, and accountable. Good luck, right? That's really where people are getting so much mis and disinformation about politics and about science. And that's a real problem. The United States is very far behind Europe in trying to deal with that. I'd like to thank everybody and share some of my favorite moments from past EARLIs, one here in Greece. Thank you for having me, and thank you for your attention today. I'd love to take some questions. We have time.
Thank you very much for your very rich, dense review of topical issues in research and practice.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting talk. I was wondering, because I'm interested in science communication, I was wondering, because I think you might also have some advice on this, how do you deal with very negative comments? Because only yesterday my supervisor was involved in a Twitter war with another scientist because she made some comments. No, she was interviewed for this, you know, pop science journal, or you know, and I think they also didn't really represent necessarily what she said. But you know, how do you deal with that? Because it kind of scares me to go into this pop science or the science communication because of this.
Yeah, that, you know, you see a lot of scientists have left the platform formerly known as Twitter because it's just so negative and vile. And now Elon Musk is talking about getting rid of the block function, which is the only way you can deal with that on Twitter. If that, you know, if that happens, you know, it'll basically be done for scientific communication, which is unfortunate. So people like Catherine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist in the United States, and a woman talks about that women in particular get, you know, death threats and, you know, gross misogynist comments. I don't know what to say about, you know, how to deal with that. I know in my own experience when I've had academic experiences that were negative or someone said something negative, mentors have said, what makes you think that has anything to do with you? That comment reflects on them. It doesn't reflect on you. And that really made me think, oh, yeah, that's on them, not on me. But that doesn't mean, you know, that you're not intimidated. And we know around the world, you know, journalists, reporters have been killed. I mean, that happens, unfortunately, quite a lot. So it is definitely scary, and I don't know what to do other than to take care of your mental health, be mindful of that, you know, remember you're doing good work, have support systems around you.
That social science departments, including education departments, have for decades encouraged their students to be wary of the notion of an objective reality, of truth, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you mean by that. I'm a pragmatist, so I believe the truth is what it is until we find it's not. So I live in, the system of I am using the evidence that's in front of me, and the beautiful thing about science is when we find that it's not what we thought, then we shift our understanding. So I'm a pragmatist, and I think if we have no appreciation of that, it's difficult to advance in science if we can't utilize that kind of approach, because otherwise it's hard to settle on any kind of consensus. We always talk in our book about consensus science. We would never say accept one study as, proof of anything. We always say look at the consensus science. In climate change, we look at the IPCC report, the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a consensus of, countries all over the world, scientists all over the world, articles in many, many, many different disciplines. And so it's the consensus. And to me, that's what we emphasize.
Thank you, Gale, for this intriguing and engaging talk. And I would have a simple question to you. What is the value of science, and what are the consequences of science denial? Why is it harmful, right? And so the question would be, what would be the role of making an attempt to convince people of the value of science and of the harmful consequences of science denial attempting to convince them to accept scientific evidence? This is, at least implicitly part of what you did, but maybe you could talk a bit more about that. It would be kind of, if you will, utility value intervention, right? Related to the value of scientific evidence.
Yeah, I think it's sort of shocking that the pandemic did not do that, because it was right in front of us, and it was close and personal to, many people in this room lost family members, I'm sure. Many people in this room probably had COVID themselves. And so I'm kind of shocked that that didn't do it for people. Maybe it did for some people, but it obviously became polarized in many countries. Now, many countries were not as polarized as the United States, and there were some European countries that actually did much, much better in terms of science communication and being on the same page and less polarized than the United States. The United States was polarized from the jump, and that made it much worse. One of the things that we, talk about and, I mention here is, that sort of place-based personal approach to science education and talking about why the science matters to you personally, getting much more personally relevant, place-based, that I think really makes a difference. We see the students in our studies that we've done locally about local issues that they're researching themselves, that becomes much more important to them. But that's not necessarily shifting attitudes and beliefs. So the kinds of shifting, what I talked about, the techniques I've talked about help with those shifts. But I would say the biggest thing is to, work towards depoliticizing, science, which sounds impossible. But that's something that we have to continue to try to do.
Add a little twist to the story, what you mentioned about the community or mainland, how they might be influenced and what strategies could be adopted. We at our university in Istanbul, Boğaziçi University, we have an assistant professor who is is an anti-evolution guy, and he recently mentioned, I'm not going to teach that content because I don't believe in it. As a scientist. I'd like to hear your reaction to these kind of...
Yeah, so it turns out science is conducted by humans. So humans have a lot of faults, and we are subject to bias, we are subject to motivated reasoning, we are subject to prejudice and all the horrible things that we're subject to as individuals. And so it's only the collective nature of science that makes science valuable. individual scientists, as we mentioned, Wakefield, can be fraudulent. Individual scientists can ignore data. Individual scientists can be corrupt. Individual scientists can have a personal agenda. And you know, we're seeing a lot of that. Right now, the transgender rights is huge in the United States. I'm not really up on how that's playing out in Europe, but there's a lot of psychologists, senior psychologists in the United States, really coming down against transgender rights right now, which is like, what? Have you read a psych book? So it's very, very interesting to see that scientists, you know, have all the foibles of all of us humans, and it's only in the collective that science is most useful. As an associate dean for research, I don't know what I'd do if I had a climate denier on my faculty, or an evolution denier. I've written a lot about evolution as well. But I might take them to coffee, like Barbara did with the climate denier, and start there, listening to their concerns, and see where it goes from there.
Thank you. So I have a question concerning, well, first of all, being a citizen who is also surrounded by people with sometimes abstract beliefs or beliefs that I don't agree with or that are not factual, or, but also with educators in mind. And I would like to ask you if you could elaborate on how you said early in the presentation that having a scientific view is having a willingness to change your mind. But then later in the presentation you mentioned that continuing to present facts to change someone else's mind is very important. So what my question really is if you could elaborate on this seemingly contradiction between having this openness yourself and also when you are, you know, in an argumentation or a confrontation with somebody with different beliefs, they will say things that they think are facts, and if you are not familiar with them, you might start doubting yourself. Do I have all the information? So if you have this scientific mindset of willingness to change your mind, do you have any advice to persist in presenting the facts?
Yeah, it's about the evidence behind those facts. So in the United States, I'm sure you're aware, there's been controversy regarding the 2020 election. And there are people who claim they have evidence of voter fraud, but they don't. Because if they did, they'd come forward with the evidence. And so what people have been doing is making claims, but without evidence. So when people make claims, you have to push them to produce, you know, evidence. You know, and then drawing on many people's, you know, work in here, like, you know, Stella's work, if you believe the earth is flat, like how do the seasons change? Like she asks people questions that cannot be answered from their perspective. They, you know, you can't have, you know, day-night cycle and seasonal change with flat earth. It just doesn't work. So they don't have explanations for that. So pushing deniers who have, quote, facts, you know, to actually, what is their evidence? To ask them what their evidence is, and that it tends to fall apart pretty quickly once you ask for evidence. Okay, I need a question from a graduate student and a woman, preferably in the same person. Are you a female graduate student? Then you're up.
I fit that description, I guess, and then I'll take that opportunity. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I was just wondering whether you could elaborate a bit about so the relationship between sort of the seemingly scientifically valid standpoint and post-colonial perspectives and the scientists.
Here's the second part, scientific valid.
And post-colonial perspectives, so scientists and researchers sort of voicing decolonizing education. I think it's really relevant in terms of how we think about education and how that sort of may influence how we think about valid knowledge.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So historically, and we talk about this in the book, so historically, you know, science, like everything else, was famously white male, right? And so obviously, you know, that's been changing. It hasn't really changed rapidly enough. So the perspectives, of course, are rooted in those orientations. And so there's quite a push to include indigenous perspectives on climate in the United States, and indigenous scholars have been really coming into the climate conversation in the United States recently in a big way. But that's something that we are working on in teacher education, and our schools of education is helping the students to understand the diversity of funds of knowledge of different perspectives, and to understand historically, where ideas come from and where they are rooted, and to understand that there are different perspectives that are very useful. And that's something we're working on in our teacher education programs, and diversity of faculty and diversity of scholarship that we bring in, indigenous knowledge and others. And so that's very important to do, particularly in the climate space, but in all of science.
In my science communication practice, I find that people are afraid of uncertainty, and science doesn't offer certainty. It offers facts and models and theories. So how can we bring people to accept some uncertainty in their lives concerning climate change or GMOs and things like that?
Yeah, I did a reputational tech study with Danny Fleming from Tübingen, I believe, who did that. He actually did a study trying to convince students that uncertainty means something different in science than it means in lay understanding. Lay understanding, uncertainty means you don't know at all, right? But we quantify uncertainty in science and the degree of uncertainty. But one thing that I would say about science communication is, while you want to be accurate, of course, in your communication, you cannot be too hedgy, because then people will think you don't know. So say what you know and say what you don't know, but be very clear to say what you know and not to be too hedgy. And I think scientists are trained to, of course, speak within the parameters of their knowledge, and so they tend to hedge. That is not a convincing communication strategy. So say what you know, and then this is about your own work too. Say what you know and how you know it. Say what you don't know, why you don't know it, and don't dwell on the parts that are uncertain, because that just puts people off, like, oh, you don't know.
The very last question you raised.
Yes, so I'm a graduate student, and I'm straight acting. I just want to call out a bit of an elephant in the room. Fascinating talk, thank you so much. And just bringing together a few of the other questions. This idea of depoliticizing is one thing, but what do you do? I mean, our sense of belonging and our identity, our tribalism, which is a sort of human characteristic, and the resistance against those things. What about faith and religion? Because faith and religion, if religious dogma, and particularly if you're very orthodox and you believe absolutely in a particular script which doesn't change, how is that? Well, I'm not going to ask you how is it compatible with science, but what do you do to change?
So we're tribal, and we care about whether we belong in a community, because in our ancient past as humans, if you got kicked out of the tribe, you just died, right? If you were out there by yourself, you just died. And so that's really hardwired in us to not get kicked out of the group. So I remember someone told me that if they were riding in a car with a bunch of older citizens in Arizona who were Trump supporters, and this one woman leaned over to my friend and she said, "I'm not a Trump supporter, but don't tell them I won't get invited to any more of the parties." So it's a very strong thing that you identify with your group. And so we have to respect and understand that. And as I mentioned in my talk, one thing you do is you change the group identity. So you switch somebody from a certain identity by highlighting. We all have multiple identities. We're not just one thing. So you highlight some other identity. So one thing I would say about the religious is that I have several articles with my colleagues Sarah Brown and Sarah Brown. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of my dear Sarah. I have several articles with my colleague Sarah Brownell, and what they've been doing is working on, and Elizabeth Barnes. She's actually Elizabeth Barnes and Sarah Brown. I've worked with them on teaching evangelical Christian students about evolution. And they work with professors who are evolutionary biologists and evangelicals. So Catherine Hayhoe, if you don't know her, she's famously an evangelical Christian who's a climate scientist So my colleagues work with evangelical Christian evolutionary biologists, and they bring them into the classroom, and these professors talk about their faith and talk about the science. And again, that gives them the connection to the students, and the students understand, oh, well, if he or she can continue to be a person of faith and stay in our faith and understand the science, maybe I can too. So I have several articles on that. Contact me and I will share them.
The EARLI, Gale, gives you a small present as a sign of gratitude and a souvenir from Thessaloniki.
Grazie.